Welcome. You're listening to the 365 Firsts podcast, a show filled with stories of experiencing first times and all the fun, growth, unknowns, and excitement that go with them. It's also the place to get expert advice, motivation, and inspiration to get in on trying new things. And now, here's your host, the master of first times, and chick you're trying to keep up with, Ann Bernard.
I have an expert guest for you, and his name is Dave Jackson. Grab a piece of paper and a pen because you're about to get expert advice before your first time starting a podcast. Dave is the host of the School of Podcasting, and he started back in 2005. It currently has over 2.3 million downloads. It's a podcast that helps people discover the power of podcasting. Dave covers everything from planning, producing, and promoting your podcasts, along with all the tools and techniques you'll need. He also helps you avoid the common mistakes that podcasters make. In 2018, Dave was inducted into the Podcast Hall of Fame. His background in teaching technical education and soon to be 15 years as a podcaster is what he brings to his School of Podcasting and how he's helped many others start their own show. And today on the 365 First podcast, he's here to help all of you. Welcome to the show, Dave.
And thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
What drew you into podcasting?
I think the biggest thing is at the time, so you got to remember, this is pre-MySpace, pre-Apple. And just the fact that at the time I was building websites, I had a newsletter. And so this was just another way to kind of get your content out there. But what really hooked me in is I'd taken the same information that I had, that I was at the time I was doing a newsletter for musicians. And so I had done that, and I just took the same information, recorded it, and put it out as a podcast. And my very first piece of voicemail came from a guy in Nuremberg, Germany. And I about fell out of my chair because I was like, did he just say Nuremberg, Germany? Because I was in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And there's a guy that not only found my podcast, but liked it, and he's on the other side of the planet. And that's when I went, okay, because I knew there was a global audience. It's not like radio where you're only as strong as your signal.
Can you quickly kind of go through your evolution with technology for your podcast?
Yeah, I mean, we started off, it was just nothing but nerds because only nerds could figure out how to create a podcast. So there was all the tech shows, the This Week in Tech. Then there was actually a little mini burst with language podcasts were there. And then we had the comedians, the Mark Marons of the world. And then right now we're in, there's a bazillion different true crime podcasts. So and entrepreneurs were in there as well. Probably the biggest evolution was I started off and everybody said that the best length of a podcast was 20 minutes because that was the average commute in America. So I made a 20-minute podcast. And the first time I went to an event, and it was kind of weird because I got to meet people that were actually listening to my show. So you kind of forget that there are people, like real people. And they're like, oh, I love your show. And I'm like, great. What can I do to improve it? And everyone I talked to said, yeah, it needs to be longer. And I was like, really? Because 20 minutes is a lot of Dave. And they're like, no, make it like a half hour, 40 minutes. So I had to adjust that. And so that's one thing that's just been along the way. And then I try to do one every year. It's usually about every other year. I do a poll. I go over, you can go to forms.google.com and make a kind of a survey for your audience. And the one thing that came out this last time I did it was, Dave, I like it when you do interviews because I do a lot of solo shows where I'm just talking to my audience, but they said, you seem to do really good interviews. So I've been trying to go out and find people that are either succeeding in podcasting or they've started a service that I think is pretty cool for podcasts. So I'm starting to do a little more interviews just based on audience feedback.
What is the first thing they need to consider and be very clear about?
Yeah, the first thing I always ask is why. If you can't answer the question why, then just don't. Because so many people are like, oh, no, it sounds cool. It's maybe fun. I'm like, that's not really a good reason. But if you say, well, either A, you want to serve people or you're trying to get your message out or something like that, I always kind of jokingly say you need the passion of a 16-year-old trying to get their license, because when you first start out, because it's new, you're going to be going through all these things that you're not comfortable with. And so it's that passion that drives you through. It's the passion that drives you through what I call the imposter syndrome. We have the people like, who would listen to me? I'm like, nope, just blow right past that. A lot of people would listen to you. So know your why. And then the other thing I would probably ask is, what are you not going to do anymore? So if that's watch Seinfeld reruns or something like that, because it does take a lot more time than you probably think it does. Now that might get shorter as time goes on, but the best I've ever been able to get it down to is what I call 4-to-1. So if I do a 15-minute podcast, it's going to take me an hour. And there are people like, wait, how does that, don't you just talk into a microphone for 15 minutes and you're done? And I'm like, well, you have to figure out what you're going to talk about. So there's some time. Then you talk about it. And unless you're perfect, you're probably going to have to do some editing, get out those ums and things like that. And then you probably should write at least a little paragraph about it so that Google can find it, because it needs words to find in the search. And then when you finally hit post, you go, congratulations, your 15-minute podcast just took you an hour. So it does take a little more time than just the time to talk.
But what about just the selecting the topic? How do you recommend people go about selecting what their show is going to be about?
Well, it has to be something, again, that you're kind of passionate about, because I always say, is it something you would talk about for free for a while? And people are like, why do you say that? I'm like, because you're going to be talking about it for free. And that doesn't mean, so many people talk about monetization, and sure, we all would like to make money with this, but there are plenty of people that just do it for fun. You need that passion. And then you have to think about, is this something that other people are going to listen to? The other thing is, so many people are like, oh, well, there's already a show about my topic. And I always love to use, I have a friend of mine, Daniel J. Lewis, does the show, The Audacity to Podcast. And so we're both talking about podcasting, but just being you have a different viewpoint. Daniel will take one topic and go ridiculously deep. He's super detail oriented, and he's kind of a just the facts kind of person. And I love the guy. And then where me, I will go in and cover multiple topics, and I will get just deep enough, like, let's go as deep as you need to go, and that's it. I'm not going to go any further than you need. And I kind of throw in weird sound effects and things like that. So it's the same topics, but they're completely covered differently.
What is the sweet spot with your experience, the people that you've helped, for the length of a podcast?
Yeah, it really, another way of wording that, instead of like, how long should the podcast be? Let's ask it, how long can you hold their attention? There's a great book called Beyond Powerful Radio by a woman named Valerie Geller. And she has one of my favorite quotes. She said, there is no such thing as too long, only too boring. Mm-hmm. And I realized that because I've listened to podcasts that were over an hour long, and I'm sitting in the driveway and I won't get out of the car because I want to hear the end of the show. I did an episode a while back, and again, most of my episodes are around 40 minutes long. This one was an hour and 15. But what I did was a brain dump of everything, any bit of advice about interviews. And it ended up being like an hour and 15 minutes long. I didn't have a single person say, wow, that was way too long, because people that want to learn about interviews were like, I listened to that thing twice and I took a bunch of notes. I know a lot of people shoot for 20 minutes. If I was doing a show that was geared towards, let's say, losing weight or exercise, I'd probably want it to be 20 minutes, because most people, like, the minimum workout is like 20 minutes. But if I was doing a busy mom show, I wouldn't do 20 minutes, because what busy mom has 20 minutes to listen to a podcast?
So you're touching on a really excellent point right now, right? So who is your audience should drive, well, obviously it's going to drive your content, but also the duration. That's such a fabulous point to make. What about the frequency of releasing?
Yeah, what I always tell people to do is, when you're first starting out again, record a couple episodes ahead of time and then see how long it takes. Because like you said, 4-to-1 would be great. Maybe it's 10-to-1 when you first start out. Okay. So it takes you, let's say, 10 hours to do a 1-hour podcast. You're like, okay, well, if I want to do one of these a week, do I have 10 hours every week to do a podcast? So we say record a couple, see how long it takes, and then pick your schedule. Because if you can be consistent with your schedule, it's not 100% that you have to, but it does come in handy, because what happens then is you become part of their routine. It's not 100% necessary. There are people that they put out an episode when there's one ready. But I always say, if you can pick a schedule and stick to it, you can.
So within my show, I started a new series. Is this something that you've ever done before, or that you recommend people doing?
The great thing about a podcast is you can really do whatever you want. It's your show. And that's one of the great things. I mean, even there aren't that many things you can say, I 100% own this. A lot of times you're sharing it with people or things like that. Like, nope, this is mine. I can do whatever I want. Number one, I always try to, and this is where sometimes having a Facebook group for your podcast can come in handy. You might want to run that by your audience and like, hey, I'm going to do, it's a show about NASCAR maybe. And on Mondays, we're going to talk about engine parts. And on Wednesday, we're going to talk about who's leading the pack or whatever. And then on Fridays, maybe we'll try to get a driver to come on or something like that. That all kind of makes sense because we're all still talking NASCAR. You have to be, again, goes back to your passion. Some people want to talk about wide varieties and some people want just one thing. And you also then, and this is what gets hard, you have to realize that not everybody's going to like you. And that's a tough one.
What is the simplest way and your advice for getting started as far as the technology goes?
Yeah, my favorite microphone, especially if you're on kind of a tight budget, is the Samson Q2U microphone. It's about, right now it's on sale for $45. So if you're thinking you have to spend thousands of dollars, no, you can get going for $45. If you're doing a solo show, you just plug that right into your computer and fire up Audacity, which is a free software program. So no money for that. I do recommend Libsyn. Now everybody says, oh, you say that because you work there, but I was a customer for 10 years and Libsyn is libsyn.com. It's short for Liberated Syndication, but they will basically be your media host and that can be as cheap as $5. Most people, it's usually 15 or 20, but you need a piece of artwork and that should be at least 1400 by 1400 pixels. Again, you could make that. There's a program called Canva, C-A-N-V-A, that if you have some sort of design skills, and actually they have templates you could use, you could make that for free. You know, there are other places that will charge you, but if you're really on a tight budget, and that's really all you need one episode. You need this thing called an RSS feed, and that's what Libsyn will give you. And then you need a piece of artwork and one finished episode. Now you can, a lot of people, oh, you should launch with 3 or 10 or 30, what I'm like, you can launch with whatever you want, but you need one. Anything above one is gravy, but that's it. And so many people think, oh, I'm not a geek. I don't know if I can do this. And I go, have you ever been in the car and like your jam comes on and you're like, oh man, I love this song. I haven't heard it so long. You crank it up and then the phone rings. And what do? You turn down the radio so you can hear the phone, to which I go, aha, you can mix audio. And then I go, have you ever uploaded a picture to Facebook? And they go, I do it all the time. Then you can upload an MP3 file to Libsyn. You can do that too. Have you ever pressed record on a DVR or a VCR or a cassette deck for those of us that remember those? Yep. Well, then you can press record on Audacity and you already know how to talk. So you've got the skills. I'm not here to say there's no learning curve because there is, but it's not as hard as you think it is.
What gets in the way? With your experience, what gets in their way to success?
There are a couple of things. One is, and a lot of times people think it's the tech. And I think because, especially over the last 10, 15 years, technology just always changes. I mean, we're talking to people on our watch now, just technology is always changing. We're kind of getting better rolling with the punches. The one that really stops people is imposter syndrome. Who is going to listen to me? And it's funny because I can tell when it starts to kick in, or in some cases, a lot of podcasters are introverts. So it's kind of cool because you can meet a lot of people without meeting a lot of people. You can do it all from your chair in your living room. You know more than you think you do. And the problem is a lot of times, if you are a person that is into, I don't know, jazz, and you know a friend who knows a whole lot more than you do, but yet if you took you and put you in a group of people who know nothing about jazz, you're an expert. The other thing that I've seen in some cases really stop people is I hate the sound of my voice. And there's a scientific reason for that. And it is the next time you're talking, put your fingertips on your forehead or on your cheekbones. And when you talk, you will feel that your head is actually vibrating. The scientific term is bone conduction. And so what it means is you actually have like a subwoofer. Like your voice sounds bassier when you talk because your skull is vibrating and it adds bass. So what happens then is when you record yourself and you play it and your voice comes out of the speakers, your skull isn't vibrating. The only thing you're listening through is your ears, not your ears and your skull. And so you're going to sound kind of thin or tinty or whatever. And I've had people like, oh, that sounds awful. And I'm like, no, it doesn't sound awful. It sounds different, but it's not awful. And I'll say, have you ever been in a really calm, friendly conversation on the phone and somebody will hang up because they can't stand the sound of your voice? And they'll go, no. And I go, then there's nothing wrong with your voice.
Now, is there anything about the podcasting, how to get started, that I forgot to ask you that you'd like to cover?
One thing you mentioned about if you miss a week or so, what you don't want to do is come back and start off, and I'm like, hey, welcome to the show. I'm so sorry I missed, last week, my grandma was sick or the car was a whatever. And you start off with this really long apology. And the good news is that's really great because it shows you care. The problem is, and I understand why you do that. The problem is somebody's going to hear that a month from now and never knew that you were gone. They're like, I'm listening to episode 26, and then I listened to episode 27, and it started off with this 4-minute apology. I'm like, and some people are like, yeah, but I really feel bad. Then put it at the end where your super fans are still listening.
Now, where can people find you online?
The best place to find me is over at schoolofpodcasting.com. You've got all my contact information and social stuff, as well as if you want to start a podcast. There's all sorts of tips and tricks over there, and you can sign up for the membership site and start your own podcast as well.
Splendid. Thank you so much, Dave, for being on the show. You passed some great information, and I think people will now be ready to get started. And they, like you said, they can reach out to you and get a lot more information that they need. So thank you.
Thanks so much. This has been great.
You've been listening to the 365 Firsts podcast. Hope you've gotten inspired to start your journey of first times and new experiences. Join the 365 Firsts Challenge by downloading the app at your local app store. Check out Next Level Firsts Coaching for additional assistance. Contact us if you want to share the stories of your latest firsts on the show. Now, go get busy having new experiences.